Welcome to the Insight Meditation Community of Charlotte. I'm Ward Simmons. I'm one of 6 Dharma leaders that rotate responsibility for leading our meetings. Welcome to those of you on Zoom, and if you would like to turn on your videos, I can see who's not in the room with me, but on the screen with me. That would be delightful. So there's a story about a Chinese Zen master, and he was called the Bird's Nest Roshi. And he got his name because he often meditated up in a tree. One day, this eminent person who was both the governor of the province he was in and a well-known poet, he paid him a visit, and he arrived while the Roshi was up in the tree. And when he found him, he said, "What a dangerous seat you have up there in the tree." And the Bird's Nest Roshi replied, "Yours is more dangerous than mine." The governor said, "I am the governor of this province, and I don't see what danger there is for me." The Bird's Nest Roshi responded, "Then, sir, you don't know yourself very well. When passions burn and the mind is unsteady, this is the greatest danger." So the danger to which the governor was referring was the possibility that a big wind would come up and it would blow the Roshi out of the tree and he would fall and get hurt or die. The danger to which the Roshi was referring is what is known in the Buddhist teachings as the 8 worldly winds. And that's the topic for tonight's talk. So these 8 worldly winds are 4 pairs of conditions that we all experience. And let me just name them. The first pair is gain and loss. Second is fame and disrepute. The third is praise and blame. And the fourth is pleasure and pain. That sound familiar? So the Buddha chose the analogy of winds to describe these conditions for a reason. When we're engulfed in experiencing loss, or being famous, or being blamed, or of intense pleasure, it can feel like we're being tossed around, buffeted by strong winds. Our own intentions can be entirely absent as we get carried along by the events that surround us. We go from an emotional high when someone praises us to being despondent when we're harshly criticized. So let's take a quick look at the sutta that contains this teaching. It's called the Lokivipata Sutta. The rest of the name is the failings of the world. And it's found, if you care about things like this, it's found in the Anguttara Nikaya, number 8.6. So I want to suggest that I'm not going to read the whole sutta. It's about 2 pages long, and if you are familiar with Pali suttas, you know that there's a lot of repetition. So I don't think reading that is the best use of our time. But I'm going to suggest that there are 3 main components to this sutta. The first is the Buddha states that these 8 conditions are everywhere around us. The way he says it is that they revolve around the world and the world revolves around them. The second component, he distinguishes between those of us who are on this path and those who are not. And I kind of like the language he uses. He calls those of us on the path an instructed, noble disciple. I like the sound of that. And he calls those who are not uninstructed worldlings. He states that these 8 conditions affect both groups, So whether you're on the path or not, you're going to be affected by the conditions. And then he poses kind of a rhetorical question to the monks he's speaking to. He says, what is the distinction between the two groups, the worldlings and the noble disciples? And then in the third component of the sutta, he answers his own question. He points out three characteristics of how worldlings deal with these winds and how those differ from the way the disciples deal with those winds. So I'm going to use his words here for a moment. So this is the first of the three. When an uninstructed worldling meets with gain, she does not reflect thus. This gain I have met is impermanent, suffering, and subject to change. She does not understand it as it really is. And then he goes on to say the same. That was about gain. He says the same thing about loss. So that's the first of four pairs. And then he says the same thing about the other three worldly winds, the other three pairs. The second, he says, gain obsesses her mind and loss obsesses her mind. And then he repeats that statement for the other three pairs. And finally, he says, she is attracted to gain and repelled by loss. Thus, involved with attraction and repulsion, she is not freed from birth, from old age, and from death, from sorrow, lamentation, pain, dejection, and anguish. She is not freed from suffering, I say. And then he repeats that for the other three pairs. And this whole language of birth, old age, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, dejection, and anguish, that's kind of used a lot, and it really means kind of the end of suffering or the presence of suffering. So then, when he's finished talking about how the worldling experiences these, then he repeats these three characteristics for the noble disciple, but he says in a positive way, the noble disciple does reflect gain I have is impermanent, suffering, and subject to change. The noble disciple says the gain does not obsess her mind, and the noble disciple is not attracted to gain or repelled by loss. Therefore, the noble disciple does not suffer. And I want to come back to these three, but first I want to look a little more closely at these four pairs. So when we think of gain and loss, maybe the first thing that comes to mind is financial. Maybe we get a new job with more money and status, or maybe the value of our retirement account goes down a lot, gain and loss. The euphoria we feel when things go right is simply the experience of being tossed around by a worldly wind. It may last a few minutes or hours or maybe even days, but it's not going to last forever. And soon, other winds are going to blow through and they're going to whipsaw us in other directions. Financial gain and loss is not the only type of gain and loss that we experience. We have gains and losses in relationships. Existing relationships fade away, new relationships develop. We become estranged from family and friends, or estrangements are healed. We encounter divorce from or death of a loved one. And these relationship changes are often the most highly charged gains and losses in our lives. We see gain and loss also in our meditation practice. At least I do. So we're consistent in our daily sittings, and that feels like a gain. And then we fall off the wagon, and that feels like a loss. One day we have an excellent sit and we really feel encouraged. And the next day, our practice is nothing but a monologue with ourselves about who's going to be chosen as the next speaker of the House. We feel like we're really progressing on the path, and then in a moment of stress, we behave unkindly, and our spirit sinks at our actions. The winds of gain and loss whip us around in every moment in ways that are both large and small. So the second pair of worldly winds is fame and disrepute. Now, if it seems like fame doesn't apply to you, don't be so quick to dismiss this pair. You don't have to be Tom Hanks or Taylor Swift for these to apply to you. Another translation of this sutta renders it not as fame and disrepute, but as status and disgrace. And I think most of us can relate to that. So gain and loss are somewhat objective. Either my portfolio went up or it went down or it stayed the same. And it doesn't have much to do with what other people think about me. But when we get into fame and disrepute, this is all about other people's opinions. And it has a really strong association with our ego. Now, just to be clear, we all have an ego, and it comes, we've got this human body and mind, and it is the way that our consciousness is packaged. We don't have any choice about that. And so eliminating the ego is not really what this is all about. Our goal is to cultivate a skillful relationship with the ego. And fame and disrepute sometimes bring up unskillful relationships with the ego. So let me ask you to just do a little experiment with me here for a moment. If you would close your eyes. Recall an experience where you felt like you were held in disrepute. When you got that in your mind, see if you can get in touch with the emotional flavor of that experience. Often, disrepute will include some ethical component. Maybe someone challenged your actions and characterized your behavior as unethical. Can you feel the wind of disrepute and the residue that it leaves? Okay, please open your eyes. So to me, this pair feels closely associated with the third pair, which is praise and blame. Few of us live lives that don't include these two worldly winds. Like fame and disrepute, they are heavily based in others' opinions and the ego. And another thing to be aware of with praise and blame is, in addition to that we receive from others, there's really a huge inner landscape of our own self-praise and self-blame. So if we're going to work with this pair of the winds, praise and blame, we have to include the internal as well as the external. There's a story I was going to tell there, but I don't think I'm going to have time. So let's go on to the last of the four pairs, which is pleasure and pain. So when we hear these terms, our minds often go to physical pleasure and pain. But equally important are mental and emotional pleasure and pain. And like gain and loss, this pair is more objective and less based on others' opinions. Physical pleasure and pain can sometimes form the basis for mental and emotional pleasure and pain. If we fall and break our foot, we experience physical pain. If we permit ourselves to be caught up in the worldly winds, we then begin to worry, to tell ourselves stories of what the consequences might be. Will I have permanent damage to my foot? Will it interfere with my ability to work? Will I lose my job? Can I afford my medical bills? This is what the Buddha referred to as the second dart, the optional mental and emotional suffering that the untrained mind layers on top of the inevitable physical pain. So I think these four pairs are a really useful way to frame this teaching, but I don't believe there's anything magical about them. I don't think that there are four pairs that were always there and the Buddha discovered them. I think he was given a talk and he had to come up with examples, and these are the four he came up with. And he could have used 3 or he could have used 5, but he was trying to make a point. So there's nothing sacred about these 4. He was trying to talk about a dynamic, and the dynamic is that there is desire and aversion all around us. It can't be eliminated, but we can control our relationship to desire and aversion, depending on whether we're on the path as a noble disciple or whether we're not on the path as an uninstructed worldling. Said another way, and this might be the most important thing I say all evening, it's not our circumstances, it's our relationship to our circumstances. And in the context of this teaching, it's not the winds that blow around us, it's how we relate to these winds. Okay, so we've looked a little bit at these 4 pairs. Let's go back to the sutta and see what the Buddha's advice is on how to deal with them. The first statement, now here I'm going to use the statements he made about the noble disciples, not the uninstructed worldlings. When an instructed noble disciple meets with gain, she reflects thus: this gain that I have met is impermanent, suffering, and subject to change. She thus understands it as it really is. So as we begin to recognize all of these 8, both favorable and unfavorable, are impermanent, we begin to diminish their power over us. What is exciting or depressing now will soon change, and we can see that, and so we're not as overwhelmed by it. We can take a deep breath and think, okay, that's here now, but soon there'll be something else. When we begin to recognize that the grasping to keep these inherently unstable conditions stable, when we recognize the grasping, then we see that our release from suffering arises when we release the grasping or the attachment. So the second statement in the sutta is, gain does not obsess her mind and loss does not obsess her mind. So when we see that attaching to the changeable worldly winds is causing our suffering, we don't obsess over keeping these inherently unstable states stable. Many of us have experienced this during meditation. While our intention is to attend to the breath or another chosen object, our mind keeps returning to some matter with which we're obsessed. As we begin to train our minds in meditation, we are better able to relinquish obsessive thoughts and abide in the present moment. So the final statement of the sutta, she is not attracted to gain or repelled by loss. Having thus discarded attraction and repulsion, she is freed from birth, from old age and death, from sorrow, lamentation, pain, dejection, and anguish. She is free from suffering, I say. And this is the message of the Four Noble Truths, that attachment is a necessary condition for suffering, and to whatever extent we can reduce our attachments, will reduce our suffering. Now, if you've been coming for a while, all of this may sound vaguely familiar. And the whole thing of not perceiving permanence in the impermanent, not obsessing over things that we can't control, not chasing after the desirable, pushing away the undesirable. And that's probably because it is familiar. What the Buddha was really talking about here, the essence of this teaching, is cultivating a state of equanimity. So if you look at the various definitions of the word equanimity, you'll find terms like non-reactive, evenness of mind, balance, stability, and composure. Equanimity is what enables us to endure the 8 worldly winds without becoming reactive, without grasping after the desirable and pushing away the undesirable. It permits us to remain composed and balanced even when circumstances around us are challenging or disturbing. Equanimity is sometimes misunderstood as passivity, but nothing could be further from the truth. To the extent we have control over a situation, it is skillful for us to bring about wholesome change. Equanimity does not mean watching from the sidelines as bad things happen. What it does mean is that we do what we can to bring about change, and then we accept the outcome without being attached to the results. So another misunderstanding about equanimity is that it's the elimination of feelings, kind of a sort of a numbness to life. And again, this is the opposite of well-developed equanimity. When we develop equanimity, we are open to our feelings, we respect them, and we validate them. There are no wrong feelings. The distinction is that while we acknowledge them to be real, we don't necessarily perceive them to be a sound basis for action. Instead, we permit feelings to arise and pass away like all phenomena, and we remain stable and non-reactive in our equanimity. For our decision-making about actions, we rely on our wisdom and our insight. Even the Buddha acknowledged his deep sorrow when his 2 primary disciples, Sariputta and Moggallana, died in rapid succession. He said to Ananda, his attendant, "I feel like I have lost my sun and my moon." He acknowledged his pain, but his strong emotions didn't supplant his equanimity. So, closing, summarize. The teaching on the 8 worldly winds is really a teaching about cultivating equanimity to avoid being tossed about by the changeable nature of our circumstances. And as we cultivate this safe harbor of equanimity, we can join the bird's nest Roshi in his perch in the tree, safely observing the operation of the worldly winds below. So I'll offer that for your consideration.